Hello! Hola! Welcome to Jacked History. I'm here to talk about things I find entertaining and hopefully give you something to tell your friends at the bar. If anything I tell you makes you uncomfortable or bothers you, just remember that none of this matters anyway. We're just a speck of beings in eternal time, and all of human history will be wiped out from memory once the sun explodes in a few billion years, which isn't that far in the scheme of eternal time. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Chances are you had to recite that little ditty when you were a little kitty, and chances are it left a long-lasting idea that Italian explorer Christopher Columbus and his Spanish crew were the first Europeans to arrive in the Western Hemisphere. I'm here to tell you why that continues to be one of the greatest lies ever told in the Americas. I want to preface my upcoming rant with the fact that there's been a lot of modern controversy over Columbus because of his treatment of the indigenous people he encountered.
It wasn't great.
And while I personally believe that's a necessary conversation that needs to be had, my intentions with this video have less to do with shitting on Columbus for his behavior and more to do with shitting on the idea of Columbus Day because it's rooted in absolute historical caca. Put it simply, if we're basing the importance of Columbus Day off the idea that he was the first European to set foot in the Americas, then we need to absolutely get rid of Columbus Day because he wasn't even close to being the first European that set foot in the Americas. Historians and archaeologists unanimously agree that Norse people, led by father-son duo Erik the Red and Leif Erikson, were the first Europeans to set foot and settle this part of the world around 980 AD, almost 500 years before Columbus. Even before that, evidence suggests Norse expeditions led by Gunnbjorn Ulfsson had temporarily landed in Greenland 100 years before Erik and Leif. But credit for its discovery often goes to the aforementioned individuals because, well, they were the first ones to have well-documented settlements. Norse people had already been staying in the previously uninhabited Iceland for years. What was once an appetizing settlement for the Norse people, who originated in modern Scandinavia, started to get a little overcrowded. The saga end of the story goes like this. Erik the Red was born in modern-day Norway and moved to Iceland with his father around age 10 because his pops committed murder in the home country. Well, the apple didn't fall too far from the tree because Erik himself ended up committing murder when he reached adulthood in Iceland because one of his neighbors was fucking with his slaves. They did things like that back then, they had slaves. And like his father, he was banished.
And for that, we are banished.
Erik managed to scrounge up some locals on his way out of Iceland and set sail for the west, quite possibly because of the stories he had heard of previous Norse explorations out of there. He spent the next 3 years sailing around and exploring southern parts of Greenland for habitable farming conditions. Upon the expiration of his exile, he sailed back to Iceland and convinced a larger group of Icelanders to join him in settling Greenland by using the tactic of naming it Greenland, to give the impression it was more lush than Iceland. Now that's good marketing, because Greenland is way harder of a place to live than Iceland. By 985, he had set up 2 large settlements in southern Greenland that numbered in thousands of inhabitants. The area became so popular that more people came from Iceland to join them, eventually bringing over a plague that killed a substantial portion of the settlements, including Erik himself. This account comes from the Norse sagas of the time. So while it gives us a good glimpse of factual events, we have to take into account that some of this information might have been dramatized throughout the years. Think of it as a game of telephone. What is undeniable based off of carbon dating and archaeological digs is that Norse people definitely did settle there in 985 and even had created trade with indigenous cultures who had come down from northern Greenland. It was generally a thriving society for hundreds of years, but experienced a still unknown decline and was eventually abandoned by the mid-15th century, shortly before Columbus showed up in the New World. They had done such a good job on their own over the years that their Danish and Norwegian overlords eventually lost contact with them and just kind of let them do their own thing. Fun side note, it wasn't until 1721 that the Danes got a little curious if there was still any of their people out there, 700 years later. So they sent an expedition, and though they didn't find any Europeans left, it was their justification to reassert their sovereignty over Greenland, which continues to this day. The moral of the story is that you can have a bunch of people do something big for you and completely not give a shit about it, then claim it as yours when it's convenient for you. Alright, so that's Erik's story, and if there's still any doubt in you of the clear factual importance of those Europeans having claim to the Americas over Columbus, let's take this a little further and dive into Erik's son, Leif Erikson. Leif, like his father and grandfather, was a badass explorer. When he came of age, he was sent back to his ancestral land of Norway to serve as the retainer for the king, where he converted to Christianity, a far different set of beliefs that his pagan father held. Hi, I don't actually have any sponsors yet, so I'm just making this up as I go along. Today's episode is sponsored by the city of Midland, Texas. Midland, Texas is an enchanted land with beautiful people and just beautiful scenery all along. Go take a visit to Midland, Texas. Book a hotel, bring the family. They have everything you need out there. He was sent back to Greenland by the king in the hopes of converting the settlers out of their paganism, who at that point were generations removed from their ancestral homeland. According to the sagas, Leif was quickly successful at converting the entire island, including his father. Shortly after his return, Leif purchased a ship from Bjarni Herlufsson, I can't pronounce these goddamn old Scandinavian names, who is said to have been the first Norseman to discover Vinland 15 years prior. Leif followed Herlufsson's route and arrived in Vinland shortly after and ended up staying a year before returning to Greenland with a proper amount of loot. Many researchers believe what the Norse called Vinland is in modern-day Newfoundland and Labrador, Canada. Archaeological digs have uncovered clear Norse settlements in the area. I can't stress this enough. All of this undisputed Norse exploration of the Americas occurred hundreds of years before Columbus set sail on his voyage. And also, according to the sagas, friendly relations with the native peoples in Greenland and Vinland occurred until a drastic turn of events changed that and they became violent towards each other. We'll get back more into that later. Upon Eric the Red's death, Leif Erikson took over as the chieftain of Greenland. So, after all the academic and archaeological communities have presented in clear evidence of Norse exploration of the Western Hemisphere hundreds of years before Columbus, why is it that American school children are still taught that in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue, fake news bullshit about him being the first honky-ass cracker to step foot in this part of the world? I'll tell you why. Superior marketing. First off, the Danish and Norwegian crowns of the time knew very little of what their weird pagan cousins were up to as they moved west of Iceland. And chances are they cared very little when they started hearing stories of new lands that were being discovered, as their new resources weren't adding any value to their European markets. So the immense discoveries that were occurring in the West probably just got naturally lost in time because of apathy.
I don't care anymore.
And minus some tales that were still being told by European sailors of distant lands up until Columbus's time, everybody else just flat out didn't give a shit. The second major reason why we're still clinging on to this Columbus caca is lobbying. You see, we have these people called Italians. I know, it doesn't seem like these people can be real with those silly accents and the weird clothes that they wear, but I did my research and they're definitely real. These Italians ended up flooding into the Americas as well, starting in the 19th century. And although they were also European like the Norsemen before them, a lot of the whites in America didn't feel like they were the right kind of white. So they treated them like absolute garbage for decades. And understandably, these Italians kind of got sick of it. One thing they had going for them was that the very man who led the Spanish expedition that first discovered the very place we're all living in was an Italian. So basically they lobbied hard to get Columbus recognized as the father of the Americas, to make being Italian look a little cooler. And it worked. Thus was the birth of the federally recognized holiday Columbus Day, which millions of American school children have learned shit history for decades now. The idea that Columbus discovered the Americas after all that we know about the Norse expeditions is like giving him the world's largest participation trophy, then claiming it's a better victory than first place. And let me go on a personal rant. Like I said earlier, the Norse were 500 years ahead of Columbus. Columbus discovering the Americas wasn't that special because it was gonna happen whether or not he existed. The French, British, Portuguese, and other European naval capabilities were right up there with the Spanish. It was only a matter of time that a European power was gonna make that same voyage. Even if Columbus never sailed that ocean blue in 1492, there would have been another rhyme about a European explorer. Probably would have sounded something like this. In 1502, Nigel Applebottom, Smith of York, sailed the ocean blue. And by the way, Columbus never even knew where he was. Until the day he died, he still thought he was doing shit around India. Don't worry, Italians. At least y'all still have Mario. Actually, technically, he's Japanese. Before I wrap this up, I want to get back to the natives and the Norse people getting into it with each other. This is a really fun story. So I've been doing a lot of research on this. I've been reading up on it a lot, but I've been also watching documentaries. And A lot of historians deduce this is what happened with the native peoples and the Norse peoples. So first off, Greenland, when the Norse people got there, was unoccupied. It wasn't like the Europeans showed up and ravaged and ruined the native peoples there like Columbus did in the Caribbean. What happened was that a lot of people think that when the Norse were arriving in southern Greenland, that right about that time is when native peoples from modern day Canada were coming up into northern Greenland, and eventually they just kind of met each other halfway. And like I've been saying, they were trading. There was probably some interbreeding with each other. There was an exchange of culture there, but at one point after 100 years or so, they just stopped talking to each other, and then the Norse people started like talking shit about them in their writings. And a lot of historians think what happened was the Norse people brought over cattle. They brought the cows that we know today, and they relied heavily off milk for nutrition back then. It was a part of their diet. And as a peace offering to the natives, they gave them this milk as a, hey buddy, thanks for being our friend, here's some milk. Well, the thing about the indigenous people of that time, their bodies were not equipped to handle milk, and basically they got terrible diarrhea. They got really sick, and they thought the Norse people were trying to poison them. So the thing I love the most about this entire story is this breakdown in communication between these two cultures basically happened over diarrhea. Please like and subscribe, I need it.